If you were sitting at home and, I don't know, presumably watching a good Filthy Heretic video, watching a lecture by Big Longus, or just literally doing anything other than watching the presidential debates, a man with a petition comes to your door asking you to sign it, a petition which, the man tells you, will be turned into the governor of your state, that's assuming you're also a Yank like me, as a means of attempting to promote the trade and ownership of weed becoming part of the legal market, whatever the hell that means. Or perhaps you receive a phone call encouraging you to vote for a bill which, if passed, would result in the state no longer harassing people for trading or owning weed. Why weed? Because that's all political libertarians really seem to care about, and if you haven't gathered by now, being the good boy I am who loves ripping up the confines of mainstream political discussion as frequently as I can, I'm suggesting in this video that hanging up or telling that dirty dreadlocked shill to go fuck themselves is a more appropriate response. Okay, allow me to digress a bit. I want to clarify that I'm not specifically talking about marijuana legalization, though that is a great example for the case I'll be going on to make. But there's a very prominent trend in thought generally, which I'm addressing today within the libertarian movement, that I find to be very concerning. This is the notion that if the state were to advertise political actions, or even follow through with decriminalizing or legalizing certain practices or resources which previously the state would have written down in its legal codes and used this as a pretext to justify harassing you over engaging in, the state deregulates or changes tax rates, then this is the state having less influence over society or losing ground, would move us closer to being free, and therefore would be seen as desirable for them to do so from a libertarian perspective. Now, one ought to be suspicious from the beginning, because this train of thought relies entirely upon three crucial implications. The first being that all economies and market activity are defined by legislative fiat, so all economies are inherently political and indistinguishable from one another. If this wasn't presumed to be true, then it wouldn't logically follow that the use of violence by the state could both simultaneously cause distortions along with artificial scarcity, while alleviating it at the same time. There are a few different problems with the first entailed assumption here, besides the inconsistency in how the effects of the state's violent suppression is being characterized. We'll get back to that in a moment, though. To start, this taken to its conclusion would assume that all communities are comprised of individuals with the same access to resources along with the same utility for said resources as one another. I don't know if this needs saying, but this is definitely one of those times where the people who argue this are not actually thinking about the implications of how they're approaching the discussion, unless they're starting from the assumption that the study of markets is not a social science, even though literally a market is just a generalized description for a way in which people in a given community exchange or associate with one another, in which case, woo lad, you have bigger issues than your view of politics in relation to society. Another issue with the first entailment, arguably because of the previously noted entailment, is that it neglects the existence of exchanges such as those in the gray and black markets which occur outside of the political economy. Well, I mean no fucking shit, because part of the argument here boils down to whether or not a market is defined by the human action of the people in whatever community we're talking about, as opposed to the market or aspects of it, such as money or interest on certain commodities, being defined by the fiat imposed onto people by the state or its political partners. But I can't stress enough how important of a factor to take into consideration this is. Not necessarily what framework you contextualize the study of markets and societies in general through, but understanding that there is actually a great deal of nuance in the implications of these competing methodologies. And to use the current subject as an example, if you were to completely ignore even discussion about how to justify one view of studying society or a approach to analyzing markets over another, or an explanation of your particular approach is coherent, not only does this weaken your understanding of the issue, as you don't have any way of substantiating or even rationalizing the principles you're proposing, and thus can't prove your conclusion to be valid in comparison to others, but for the same reason, this also means not being able to rule out competing claims of truth or competing attempts to explain the same principles. The existence of gray and black markets, this being trade which occurs with goods or services produced outside of the state's political infrastructure, themselves present a huge problem for the latter idea of how to understand markets, because their mere presence introduces the prospect of the state's means of accounting being unable to factor in all of the exchanges which occur among people in their claimed territories. A political infrastructure can never actually encompass all trade, and thus even in concept, one cannot argue that the interests motivating people to associate with one another can somehow be traced back to the state's fiat. This is aside from the fact that if what we're understanding to be a market is an area or means of association defined by the state's fiat with the infrastructure of which prescribed by the state or imposed from the top down through rates set by political cartels, that this wouldn't even be a study in the first place in any meaningful sense of the term, because you're not observing the actors who are actually making up the exchanges in this market, but trying to socially engineer their incentives around the interests of a small handful of organizations. Not to mention that if you could just use fiat to prescribe economic incentives to people, then markets would on paper be able to exist even though literally no actual production or trade is occurring, when in reality, if no production or trade was occurring, the earth would be nothing but a giant pile of bodies because everyone would have starved to death a long time ago. Just to put this into perspective, if you were to try and create a model to explain this approach to market study using literally the most widely constructed famous thought experiment in economic theory, the Robinson Crusoe scenario, in other words, have a small community isolated on an island, and attempt to explain from the ground up using economic principles, using this sample, the construction of an economy, you would immediately run into inconsistencies, because any action any of the people in this thought experiment would engage in would be absent any sort of monopoly structure using violence against the people there to create a political economy. Though it would be helpful to use this model because properly understood, it's true that there is an attempt to construct a legal market, so to speak, when the state is present in society, and that the state can certainly influence the incentives people have to use their resources along with how they can without being harassed by the state's enforcers. No one's denying this, but it's not accurate to argue that the state attempting to create a political economy suddenly means that all markets within the state's jurisdiction, along with all activity within them, no longer operate around or could be distinguished from others by the human action and consequently marginal preferences of the actors in these communities. It's for this exact reason that governments have different jurisdictions in different territories, and all of those jurisdictions have different financial needs to continue sustaining their influence and maintaining the political infrastructure in a given area that they're in. This is also why they have a necessarily more difficult time functioning in the major metropolitan centers. Every town, every neighborhood, every household has a different economy from the other. Legislative decrees, along with their enforcement, serve the sole broad purpose in an economic sense of creating artificial scarcity by threatening people who trade or produce goods or services with violence in order to more or less intimidate people into pursuing ends which otherwise wouldn't be in their interests, or at the very least wouldn't be in their most highly valued preferences. They also create a privileged political class of market actors by limiting who can in or can't produce in certain markets through monopoly grants, such as the IP system or corporate law, and to give said actors, therefore, along with state agencies themselves, more leverage over the models of these firms, the way these firms use their resources, who these firms associate with and sell to or buy from, etc. When a certain market is deregulated or decriminalized, we shouldn't see this as the state becoming less onerous then. Rather, it would be more accurate to characterize this as the state attempting to curb competition in the markets for these commodities, and to attempt to influence the supply of these goods or services by gaining direct leverage over the firms which produce these commodities through both legislative and financial means, in turn producing more taxable assets for itself by ensuring that the majority of the people who are actually supplying these goods are political actors. In other words, the state co-opting the markets in question. If you look at the weed market, since this has been the area of the black market that has been seeing a trend in decriminalization or deregulation in the last few years through the US, well, what being able to legally sell weed entails varies depending on the state, but overall, if you're a licensed weed dealer, then this means having, of course, to provide a detailed log of expenses along with who you sell your product to. Automatically, this entails having to associate with a legal market bank along with politically connected suppliers who all have the same sorts of strings being pulled in order to influence their business, and setting up a business account, the credit rating of which being able to easily be manipulated by the Department of Justice for whatever reason they choose, along with the bank itself if your business doesn't make a certain amount of profit every month or so, the rates at which the banks themselves demand profit being determined by the interest rates issued by the Federal Reserve. If you don't register your business as a corporation, then because you're a seller in the state's legal market, your competitors would be able to sue you by citing various statutes which are so broad to where they only exist as a means of giving politically connected state partners pretext to sue their competitors out of business, an example of which would be antitrust laws. This entails having to issue out stocks on your assets, which is an incentive reinforced by also having to associate with white market banks, meaning now that your assets are partially owned by other people and they can influence how you use your resources in pursuit of their own ends, which aren't necessarily your own, because by this point the state and its political partners to get you here already have placed about 5 to 6 levels of leverage over you and your assets, along with limiting your suppliers to a small handful of sources, meaning that it becomes more difficult to turn a profit from the start because you have a smaller amount of ways you can obtain more resources and more people are taking more of the profit that you make. On top of all this, there are a smaller number of ways in which you can legally grow weed, the soil you use, methods, etc., which on top of decreasing the quality of your weed and, again, making it more expensive to produce, also means the FDA and or the FTC are going to be constantly watching you and inspecting your home. Because the free market is when the government stops you from trading with the people you actually want to, have other people who you've never even met claim ownership of your assets, and have the Gestapo come to your house every week, and if you're not buying soil from Lowe's, deciding that you can't make a living anymore. Because all of the hoops legal weed dealers have to go through, the market for weed becoming largely encompassed within the state's infrastructure has resulted in it becoming more difficult and capital intense for black market, now gray market weed dealers as well, because of how much more expensive it is to buy or sell weed. So in the same way that inflation effectively is a tax on savings, which is distributed to politically connected investment firms, deregulation or decriminalization is a tax on the gray and black markets, which benefits politically connected actors in the state's legal economy. The weed market particularly calls into question as well the argument provided by political libertarians and statists that deregulation or decriminalization of a commodity in question necessarily will result always in said commodity becoming more abundant and profitable to trade, What if the commodity was more profitable and abundant in the absence of its presence in the legal market? In either case, it's not valid to argue that deregulation or decriminalization entails the state having less influence over that aspect of the market. As a matter of fact, decriminalization specifically suggests the opposite. It's implied directly in the concept. If trade within a certain market wasn't legal, then it becoming legal now means that there's a place within the political economy specifically set up by the state for these exact commodities to be traded by people who the state says can trade them. But even in the markets where this is true, i.e. markets where deregulation would mean that artificial scarcity created by the state's presence goes down and more people can buy because of this, again, pay attention to where the profit is going within the legal market, along with the sort of incentives which are manufactured by the state for the political class of producers, i.e. people who the state chooses to give licenses to. So from the standpoint of market study, the political economy absorbing more areas of the markets and obtaining more influence over them creates a form of stealth redistribution from non-political producers into the hands of their politically connected friends, and the state itself consequently has more resources it obtains through tax revenue it can use to further expand its influence over society. So even if we were to accept the notion that the government changing its decrees or how they're enforced was somehow a step closer or further away from freedom rather than a calculated decision to manipulate the incentives of people in its declared territories, this clearly ain't it, Chief. The second entailment is that legislative decrees, along with the state's enforcement of them, make the state's presence in a given society, in an ontological sense, fundamentally distinguishable from a free society, and more importantly, that because of this, it makes sense to see what the state claims through legislative decree to be getting us closer to or further away from freedom, depending seemingly on how onerous the state's claims are. Now, from the start, this idea of a free society versus an authoritarian society more or less has the same issues that were previously noted in attempting to create a postulate description for how markets supposedly are studied, since it entails making ethical truth claims. Not surprising given that ethical philosophy, like the study of markets, is derived from a study of social organization. Because what's being argued between different methodologies in ethical philosophy is whether or not, or specifically what actions can be conceptually justified in association between different moral agents. Since what we're observing requires inputs from actual people, it's not coherent to operate around the notion that societies or behaviors can be prescribed by the mere observation of ethical truths. The fact that murder is unjustifiable doesn't provide an active deterrent to murderers, for instance. There is no point at which you leave an authoritarian plane of existence and enter a free one. In fact, historically, there have been many regimes that have collapsed, and it's taken decades for people who lived under them to recognize it. The fall of the Roman Empire, for instance. Properly understood, assuming by free we mean a society absent a monopoly on arbitration, and we agree that the NAP is the ethical conclusion that explains the most, in either case, ethical claims are based on conceptual truths about the nature of moral agents acting upon one another. Which, by the way, like the study of markets, is the reason why you can't just go full retard and dismiss ethics as a field of study. Denying ethical study entails denying the existence of conceptual truth. But anyway, ethical truth is supposed to be a foundation upon which we can use to identify problems within our societies that are making it more difficult for people to defend their rights, and ways to undermine those inequalities of authority, rather than an ontological claim about the nature of morality or how people will organize to enforce laws. And just like the problem with the political view of markets, it's incoherent to talk about ethics relative to the state without this being inherently implied. If the state's mere presence being diminished, assuming that's what legalization actually does to any meaningful degree, made us freer, then why would access to resources have anything to do with your argument against the state? Since how available resources are does factor into it, then how could you argue that deregulation or decriminalization, any other sort sort of state's decree could somehow undermine the state's ability to function as a coherent material organization. And as an organization with a definable set of interests, why would it function deliberately against its own interests just because you begged it to, which said organization also encouraged? So in conclusion, the libertarians who advertise partyarchy and state decree as a step towards ending oppression in our society, wittingly or not, are selling you cyanide powder marked as caked sugar. The fact that the state itself promotes this argument through its media and directly through politicians should tell you everything you need to know about the validity of this framework. Politics are nothing more than a series of multi-layered advertisements for the state's legislation. The state's legislation itself not having an objective framework for interpretation due to laws by nature inherently being very subject to interpretation, since there's nothing in a law itself inherently providing a means by which one could argue the concepts which are referenced are more objective than others. This is why even among the state's courts, for instance, judges have disagreements over the interpretation of laws. The political framework for how society is formed is itself an advertisement for the state's role within a society to some extent. Those arguing for the political perspective, for instance, almost never even attempt to justify or even explain why it's valid to argue that the state creating a decree will achieve their explanation of what it supposedly would, or even more bluntly, how you could arrive at the negation of politics through legislative decree, an inherently political act. But anyway, that's all for today. If you liked this video, please comment, rate, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.